Hello and welcome to the SWBN News Watch, where we report global events from a Christian perspective. I am Chijioke. Thanks for joining us today for this very necessary conversation. In our previous panel discussion, we made efforts to answer the grand question, should a believer prepare for death? And we received a lot of positive feedback. It seemed to have quashed the idea that writing a will or buying health insurance policies was a sign of unbelief, and many appreciated the idea of talking about this crucial matter with their families and loved ones. Today, we'll be looking firmly at the how. How should a believer prepare for death? What are the practical steps that families or individuals can take? I won't be doing this alone. We have a returning guest, Sister Joy Duncan, who is the Executive Director at OmniBlue Aviation Limited, the founding partner of Jeddah Law Associates, a passionate love of God, and the secretary to the SWBN board. You are welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me, Chimila.
The pleasure is all mine. We also have Brother Chijioke Akwukwuma, Managing Director and CEO of Ocean Deep Drilling ESV Nigeria Limited, ODENL, also a member of the advisors at the African Energy Chamber and a member of the SWBN editorial board. You're welcome back to the SWBN News Watch.
Thank you, Chimila. Glad to be back.
So during our YouTube live stream, Moinoluwa Debayo dropped this comment, quote, "There are several ways a believer can arrange his assets while living, that a testamentary disposition will not be necessary as an alternative to wills," unquote. Sister Joy Duncan, please tell us what your thoughts are on this.
Okay, I recall that I made allusion to that in passing while we were at the topic. There are certainly other ways to take care of making preparations for your assets and how they would devolve in the event of any eventuality. And one of those, like for spouses, I had said you needed to acquire most of these assets you have as joint owners, joint ownership, joint accounts. I mean, when the Bible talks about the two becoming one flesh, it's not just one flesh as in intimacy of the body, but of virtually your purpose for coming together. And it impacts every other thing because you do most of every other thing together for yourselves and for your children and for your posterity. So like having joint accounts and managing them based on agreement and on mutual understanding is one of the ways, because in the event that one person is no longer there, the other party seamlessly just continues to operate those either investments or accounts and or property without having to go through the rigors of provisions of the law in order to transfer those the ownership of those assets back to his or herself or to the children. So that's one way. The other way was, I had mentioned the issue of creating trust. Now, trust, as in the word trust, is a fiduciary relationship that a grantor, an individual, has with a third party. It could be a body of individuals, it could be an individual, it could be a corporate organization that actually gives those services, where you create a trust, where you include everything, virtually everything you have, your bonds, your stocks, your shares, your landed properties, even life insurance proceeds and all that. And then you put them into a trust deed, a trust relationship, and in a trust, you have three parties: the person granting the trust, the trustee, like I said, could be a body of individuals or a corporate organization who undertakes those services by law, and then the beneficiary of that trust or trust fund. Now, the proceeds, you take the management of those things from yourself and hand it over to that third party for the benefit of the beneficiaries. I wouldn't want to go into all the nitty-gritty of law. However, the benefit is that whether you are there or not, of course, we have what is called a living trust and a trust that is activated upon death. There are people that create a living trust that even for themselves, it's also a way of managing family property, family assets, so
all right.
the proceeds.
All right. Let me pause you a little bit at that point. Thank you so much for that. We want to hear your thoughts on this, Brother Chijioke. From your experience, what alternatives have worked best for the cases or persons you've dealt with or known?
So many of the things that Sister Joy has already spoken of are things that I've seen work. So not only are they're good practices. So for example, married people should be buying properties in their names. And I would confess that as a young person, some of these things I did not know. I started doing investments from a really early age. I had my first property when I was still single, and I had that mindset of doing investments in my name. It was a few years after we got married that my wife called me and said, "Look, you better start doing it in both of our names." And it made a lot of sense. So sometimes it's just a case of people don't even think about these things, and so it's very important. Sometimes you could also I've also seen situations where you could go one step lower than a trust, because there's some expenses related to maintaining trust and some of these instruments. There's sometimes that it could be a bit simpler with regard to buying some of your assets in a company name and simply having your family members as stakeholders in that company. So there are different ways that one can go around it. But like Sister Joy said, there are lots of technicalities. I think the important thing is people understanding that these things are there and they can be used. And then you have specialists like Sister Joy, legal people, and people who are actually in that field that you now go and ask for advice based on your unique circumstances. So like in Nigeria, you have Stanbic IBTC trustees. One can go and approach them and they will provide advice for free. People can have discussions with them and say, how can you help me? I'm planning to, the way I look at it, putting a will or all of these instruments together is to help you with generational wealth. So we talk about generational wealth, but if you don't plan to pass on wealth to the next generation, then what really do you mean by generational wealth? And so it's really a case of saying, how can you help me package this so I can pass on my wealth to the next generation? It becomes a bit more complicated when people have assets in multiple jurisdictions, that's in different countries. Then you really need a lot of advice on how to handle the different investments you have that cross borders.
All right. Thank you very much for that, sir. Let's say that right now a believer has just found himself or herself in a position where their patriarch, that is the head of their family, has departed without clear instructions as to how to share the possessions or assets in the family. What should a person do to manage that very situation? Ma'am, please give us your take on this very one, please.
Okay. Now, somebody is faced with a real life situation where, according to your question, the patriarch or the matriarch has passed. And like we said the other time, there was a lot of confusion. Nothing was provided for. I would say if this person is an adult and is able to take decisions, there is something called letters of administration. Now, letters of administration is a tool that is used to do the same thing a will, a trust, and the rest would do. However, it is given by probate. That is the part of the court that handles matters of inheritance, testacy, and intestacy. Now, the letters, when somebody dies intestate, in fact, it can apply both ways. Somebody dies intestate, that's without making a will. So either the next of kin or the responsible person in the family can apply to probate for letters of administration. Now, all the letters of administration is another process, winding process. But what it does, when that letter is obtained, the people or the person to whom it is granted by the court now have the right and authority to administer the estate, as the property, personal and real, of the deceased person. Or it also could be given where there is a will, but is a partial, we call it partial intestacy, where somebody made a will, but didn't put executors who were going to administer or execute that will, or put them, but they are incapable. Maybe they themselves have died and it didn't change the details, or they are incapable, or they refuse to act, maybe because of the peculiarity of the family. Now, the next of kin who has responsibility, like a senior person of the family, can now request for that. So that is what it does. And once you have that, you can now administer the estate for the beneficiaries according to law. Okay, because if you go ahead, if that person goes ahead and starts to administer without that backing of the law, it is illegal and the person can actually go to jail for that.
Wow.
That's basically another way that person can address the situation.
All right.
I don't go into so much details, but if there's need, I will interject. And yeah.
All right. Thank you very much for that, ma'am. For the young person who has some savings or properties, how should they go about ensuring that their savings are accessible in the case of an emergency or even death, as the case may be? Sir, this question is for you. But before you go ahead to answer it, earlier this year, I had lost one of my brothers in the faith, and one of the things we observed that his savings in piggy vest, nobody knew the password to it, and till now, nobody has access to that savings. So, I want you to advise us, how should we go about this very scenario, this very situation, sir?
So I think that it's important. Now, sometimes a person could have the investments and savings and the person is not married. When you're married, I think it's a little bit more clear-cut and more well-defined. Like Sister Joy has said, really the two should become one. There's nothing that a man or woman has invested in that the wife should not know about and should not have knowledge of how to access it. So practically, for example, in some of the cases I'm familiar with, people actually keep spreadsheets of everything that they own, what the passwords are to some of the account details. So they have somewhere where it's documented that is known to themselves. And if it's kept in an electronic format, for example, it's really properly encrypted and kept somewhere safe. And only the people who need to have that information know the password to where the encrypted information is kept. So if something happens to one of them, they know to go and check either it's a stick on a computer, but it's best to keep it somewhere outside of the internet where it cannot be hacked. They know to go and check that information. They have the password to the file, and there they can see everything that is owned. And in fact, some real details are there, who the relationship managers are, who the investment was done through, who the lawyers are. And so you know who should be contacted in the event that you're trying to recover the assets of the person. Now, for a young person who perhaps is not married, and I can give my own example. Like I said, I started investing from a really early age before I got married. And so in my case, for example, my dad knew what I was doing. He had the details of the things I was involved in. So if anything happened to me, my dad would have been the one who would have been able to access everything that I was involved in. So I think it's a case of identifying people that you trust, one or two people, and giving them some detailed information. And it could be your lawyer. And it could be done in such a way that you give instructions and say, okay, this drive or this letter that I've written, keep it sealed, except something happens to me, then release it to X and Y person. So there are different ways to go about it. But I think fundamentally, the issue is that quite often people are not really thinking along these lines. But these are things we need to think about. And I think some of the things we're saying are some practical things that can be done. And it can be sometimes an unpleasant conversation to have. So for example, when I was having the conversation about my wife and telling her where everything is, the first time I had that kind of conversation, her initial comment to me is, why exactly are you telling me all of this? You know, nothing is going to happen to you. I said, I know nothing is going to happen to me, but it's important you have this information.
All right. Thank you very much for that, sir. The average person has trust issues. People have been burnt even by close people. So when you have a sibling, spouse, or even a friend as a next of kin, are you supposed to inform them of such privileges, considering the fact that people have been burnt? It's a hard take. What are your thoughts on this, ma'am?
Emphatically, yes. When you appoint someone in your documents, maybe the office, the bank, or wherever, as your next of kin, it shouldn't be a secret to the person you've appointed, so that that person is well informed, has foreknowledge, and in the event he or she is called upon, he or she knows that he or she stands in that stead. Now, what I would want to clarify is that the word next of kin has been either misunderstood or abused. A next of kin, even biblically, is your closest relative. We sing that song, "You're my nearest kinsman." That's your closest blood relative. But in normal parlance, it could be that, and it could even be a friend. It could be anybody whom you trust. Now, the next of kin does not make you a heir to what's the word now? To inherit substance that have been left. A next of kin can be applied, has signification in three ways. Somebody that can be called upon at any time relative to information about you. Somebody that can be called upon and can act on your behalf in the event of eventualities. Maybe there's an accident, there is a health condition, and they need somebody to take a decision when you are incapable of doing so. And it could also be that you can also be a heir. Some people make their children who have become adults their next of kin and all of that. So under the law, whether testacy or intestacy, that child or that spouse too can inherit. So in that application, in the general sense, when you are made a next of kin, you are just to take decisions on behalf of that person in the event of whatever eventualities, even if it's in the event of death.
All right. Thank you very much, ma'am. Any additional thoughts on this, sir?
I think Sister Joy made a really good distinction there, because I think many times when people talk about next of kin, they use it interchangeably with beneficiary. They're not necessarily the same. They could be the same, but they're not the same. So, for example, when you fill in the form in the office and they say, who is your next of kin? Strictly speaking, it should be a case of who should we contact in case you become incapacitated or in case you die. It doesn't necessarily mean who is going to inherit what you have, but we typically think about it along those lines, that once you see next of kin, it's beneficiary. And also, it also depends on, because I imagine that there may be people from different countries also listening to our conversation. Sometimes it depends on the jurisdictions that you're in. So in the US, for example, next of kin is more closely associated to beneficiary than under UK law and Nigerian law. But there's that distinction. So putting somebody as your next of kin doesn't necessarily mean the person is going to inherit something. So there should not be any reluctance to share information with people that you think should have the information. I think it's a sad commentary if an individual doesn't have anybody that they can trust.
All right. Thank you very much for that. So we are still looking at how should a believer prepare for death. And this is what Sister Akwukwuma said after watching the last panel discussion. Quote, I am glad this is coming from us and we are talking about it in church. We have to honestly talk about it in our homes. We have to have these difficult conversations. Still quoting Sister Akwukwuma, my father was a very educated man, widely traveled and enlightened, but he never had a will. He talked about death. He had so much assets, but he did not do what he was supposed to do. And we as his children went into chaos. So we really need to have these conversations in our homes and families and take a further step to implement, thanks to SWBN, end of quote. Now, this comment makes me ask, what can the church do to encourage this kind of conversations among believing families? Please, any of you are free to take the question, answer the question rather.
All right. Okay, sorry, Sister Joy, please. You
go ahead. I'll say something when we are done.
Okay. No, I was going to say that part of what the church can do is to encourage conversations like this taking place and not make it a taboo subject, to help with teachings that would help brethren resolve the conflict in their minds between the sounding of the trumpet that speaks about immortality and life and death being swallowed up in victory, and what I would call transferring your wealth to the next generation. There seems sometimes to be a conflict in people's mind to say, if I'm preparing a will or talking about that, does it mean that I don't believe in some of the messages that are being preached? But I think when we look at it from the perspective that you're simply planning to transfer wealth to another generation. Now, if you're around, then the transfer doesn't need to happen. And frankly, I think by the time the things we're looking onto the Lord for start happening, some of these things won't be things that we're bothered about. And hopefully, our children who are also who are receiving the same ministration that we're receiving, and also not going to be bothered about whether they have 10 Naira in Guaranteed Trust Bank account or not. There will be bigger things that we're dealing with at that time. But it doesn't stop from putting these plans in place. So I think there can be teachings that are done that provide the biblical foundation and principles to make it easy in the minds of people to have these conversations, because they're not easy conversations to have.
Okay, I would say yes. In fact, my 3 words is teach, exhort, and guide. Speak about them in forums, in our couples fellowships, in our youth forums. Even the church begins in the home. Talk about them in the home. As your children get understanding, grow, talk about these things. Now, we follow in the footsteps of our master. God had a will. He expressed that will. And for us today, the church that have understanding is even interpreting and seeing the happenings of how he wants his world governed. Is that we're all expressed by his will. The book of Hebrews, certain chapters really emphasize the issue about a testator and the beneficiaries. And that becomes a platform and a foundation for us to build on. Jesus knew the will of his Father, and so he was able to play it out. The Father has shown us his will. Even the book of Revelation is a lot about the will of God for the end of time. And the church are the ones that will execute that will. So just as it is spiritual, it is also for us, spiritual people in our natural environment. We should be able to talk about these things so that we know how to carry on. And like my brother said, well, at the end of the day, we enter into life while we are here. All is for the purpose of that new kingdom, the inheritors of the earth will have to play to play by and play within that environment. So I think the church should be intentional about teaching, exhorting, encouraging, and guiding where people need guidance in this.
All right. Thank you so much, Sister Joy Duncan. We will have to stop here. Thank you so much for coming on the SWBN News Watch, Brother Chijioke Akwukwuma and Sister Joy Duncan. We appreciate you for coming back to answer these questions, for giving us your time and your wealth of knowledge. May the Lord be your reward. Amen.
Amen. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, folks. Thank you for staying with us until now. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe till we meet next Thursday, 9 p.m. I remain Chijioke. Stay tuned.